State is triumphant versus Notre Dame, winning 34-23, capturing their first national title since 2014. And now Ryan Day is in the likes of legendary coaches such as Woody Hayes, Urban Meyer, and Jim Trussell, and really a long time coming. And one of those things where all of the pressure has been on Ryan Day and on Will Howard, and everything really just kind of seemed to come together for this team. Especially, shout out to Notre Dame too for having one hell of a year, beating 5+ teams who are ranked on the AP poll, beating Indiana and Penn State and whatnot on their way here. But overall, just a lot of just time for Ohio State to have their moment in many ways. Since Ryan Day took over, there's been pressure after pressure after pressure of having some of the most talented teams in the entire country and just falling short, whether it's about beating Michigan or just not making as far into the playoff or just not exceeding expectations. And really everything just kind of really just came together for him this season. And before I talk about Ohio State and give it all them some credit too, I think it's fitting to just talk about Notre Dame a little bit and also just give them some credit for what they've done. That first drive that they had with 18 plays was just incredible too. And I talked about this in my preview of the national championship game a couple days ago, but Riley Leonard as a runner really was the most important factor of this game. And I know a lot of the time the members of the media were mainly talking about him as a passer, but I knew going into this it would be about him as a runner. And even if you look at the stats of Notre Dame's rushers, aside from Riley Leonard, Love and Price only had maybe 20 yards combined. I mean, Jeremiah Love only had 4 carries for 3 yards. So you already know going into the game that his knee had to be messed up to the point where he was essentially a non-factor in this game too. And especially too, once when Ohio State was able to do some bump and run on the outside, I mean, aside from Jaden Greathouse, there was really not many receivers that primarily got open. I mean, Mitchell Evans had a moment here and there, but for the most part, it was the Riley Leonard running show. And when Greathouse was wide open here and there for a couple of receptions and a touchdown pass, but ultimately, at the end of the day, Ohio State proved to be the more talented team because especially through the Fighting Irish's next 4 possessions outside of the first drive, Ohio State was able to build a 31-7 lead. And by that point, they really kind of sealed the deal and everything. But in terms of Notre Dame, they stayed true to their identity, like I said that they would. However, it got to a point by the second half where you realize that Ohio State, not only are they simply just too talented, but it just got to a point where I think they've really missed Ben Morrison in this game. I think if he was around, it definitely would have been a little bit more interesting too. But also that defense being out on the field so much, primarily because Notre Dame's run game was essentially non-existent outside of Riley Leonard having 42 yards. I mean, it was just one of those games where it was a recipe for disaster for him in many ways. And even Herb Hertree mentioned on this in the Gamecast, but Notre Dame didn't run much zone at all. And when they did have a couple moments when they ran zone and tried to pressure Will Howard, those corners were respecting Jeremiah Smith and Ibuka so much to the point where they were just giving him so much leadway. And Chip Kelly kept calling comeback and crawl routes to the point where they essentially were just essentially communicating, hey, as long as you keep these receivers up front, Ohio State, they're going to take those 7-8 yard completions all day and be in manageable second and third down conversions throughout the game. And that's one of the many reasons why essentially they were in really a bunch of situations where they were to march down the field successfully, be able to score touchdowns. And Will Howard, for the most part, was essentially flawless in this game, especially when he had those 13 completions to start the game. He had 2 touchdown passes, and he really turned it on in terms of being the leader of this team, especially, going to the beginning of the season. Everybody knows about his history at Kansas State. 3-year starter, absolute stud. has all the intangibles to make it to that next step. But everybody was kind of questioning themselves, is Will Howard truly an upgrade to Kyle McCord? And Will Howard ultimately won the offensive player of the game, and rightfully so. And through all of this, hey, he had 75% completion percentage, 1,100 yards, 8 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions through this playoff. And, when you play teams like Tennessee and Texas and whatnot too, they deserve a lot of credit for what they've accomplished too. And Ohio State, essentially, they did everything that they had to do in order to win the national championship game. I really admire that Jim Knowles was pretty aggressive in terms of their defense. They stacked the box when they had to. They didn't let Riley Leonard really get outside of the pocket too much. I mean, yes, he created some plays here and there, being able to run outside the pocket and be able to extend some plays a little bit. But outside of that, Ohio State did an incredible job at shutting down those receivers, at making sure that Riley Leonard, aside from that first drive, was really a non-factor in many ways, and ended up being a predictable outcome in that way. Because Notre Dame, yes, they deserve a ton of credit for what they've done, and they are in the position right now where they can definitely build off of that. And granted, Notre Dame is always going to have some challenges in terms of recruiting, in terms of being an independent. Also, it helps that they got a nice $20 million paycheck despite losing the game. That always helps. But at the same time, too, they're going to face a lot of similar problems to what they did at the beginning of 2024, in the sense of, okay, they're going to have to go out and get another quarterback. They're going to have to go out and definitely plug up the cornerback situation a little bit more. I'm definitely curious to see what happens with particularly their front seven. How do they get a couple more linebackers in there? They need a little bit more depth on that front. And for the most part, too, everybody's going to sit there and say, hey, if they have a couple more receivers, this, that, or the other. But at the same time, too, Notre Dame, they're just that type of team that's going to be gritty, that's going to be physical, and they're going to run the ball against you. So at the same time, I don't necessarily think they have to sit there and say, oh, all of a sudden we're going to be a passing team and we're going to air raid and whatnot too. They can keep with the same sort of style that they have. Mike Dunbrick is a great play caller too. And I think when Brian Kelly was sitting down watching this national championship game, I think he has a tinge of regret for getting rid of him in place of Joe Sloan, if you ask me. But in any event, Notre Dame is in such a great spot right now, and I'm intrigued about how they move forward too, because Marcus Freeman is the pillar of exactly what you would want as a head coach at Notre Dame, somebody who understands the vision, who's disciplined, who pays attention to detail, and understands game management to a T. And people will sit there and criticize the field goal attempt in the fourth quarter, but I would push back on that. In my opinion, I would have done the same exact thing, in the sense of, okay, you kick that field goal, you're down by 13 now, and instead of having to go get 2 touchdowns and make 2 2-point conversions, you essentially make it a 2-score game where, as long as there's no funny business on the extra point, all of a sudden you're in a position to win the game after two touchdowns. And if we're talking about a 4th and 3 or 4th and 4 and they kick the field goal, I can see there being some valid criticism, right? But on a 4th and 9, in that situation, you need to take the points and move on. And unfortunately, Mitch Jeter couldn't hit that kick. But at the same time, too, the writing was on the wall at that point, too. And big shout out to Chip Kelly, especially on that 3rd and 11 call, taking a shot deep and realizing that, especially for Will Howard, realizing that mismatch between that Jeremiah Smith had going deep, and also that same storyline over and over again of these cornerbacks really making sure that they have some extra distance. That way they made sure they were in front the whole time. But that time, I mean, you just can't match that speed that Jeremiah Smith has. But in many ways, a big day for Ryan Day, and a big weight off his shoulders too. But we'll definitely be curious to see how they move forward from here, how they respond in terms of the 2025 season. I mean, now that we know that Will Howard's graduating, we know that Devin Brown just signed over with UCal, and now that they have some questions at quarterback, it's definitely going to be pretty intriguing about how they decide to figure out how they're going to fill these new spots, and most importantly, how they decide to move forward from here. But